Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Varun Sriram with Generation UCAN, and we've got a really fascinating discussion tonight on how to become a better butter burner for health and performance. Really thrilled to be joined by Dr. Mark Cucuzella tonight. Hey, Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Varun. How are you?
Doing fantastic, and really happy to have you on, Mark, to share your insight with us. And you really bring a unique perspective to our discussion today, Mark. So you're quite an accomplished runner, two-time winner of the Air Force Marathon, and you're also, as a physician, on the front lines of treating people and really helping them get healthy. You know, people often in dire circumstances. So tell us a little bit about what you do and kind of your relationship both with health and running and how you've been able to intertwine them.
Well, thank you, Varun. It's a privilege to be on the webinar here and speaking to people probably from all over the world. This has been shared out through your pages and mine. But a little of my background, so I'm a family physician, which in other countries is a general practitioner. So I take care of people of all ages, from delivering babies up to geriatric care. Most of my work now is in a hospital setting, and do a lot of work with cardiac stress testing, and then metabolic clinic work, meaning trying to help people reverse their metabolic conditions, which we'll talk about during this webinar. So that's my medical side, but my passion is like many of the listeners out there. I just love sports, and I've been an active kid, and I think I'm still a kid at age 50. I started running competitively at about age 13 when they decided to put me in some races, and I've been running ever since. And I learn new things every year, and I think I've learned everything from other athletes and patients, so I continue to learn. That's why I love, clinical work, and I love working with athletes. I have a shoe store too, so I see people come through my shoe store who are athletes who are asking questions. So I have many ways that I interact with people.
So Mark, you're very, plugged in to the athletic community. This idea of becoming a better butter burner, first of all, what does it mean? And have you seen any sort of increased interest in this topic of conversation in recent years?
Oh my gosh, yeah, I mean, when I went to medical school and as a competitive runner, I ran collegiately at University of Virginia in the mid-'80s. So, I mean, it was assumed, it was a done deal that if you were in any kind of sport, you needed to eat carbohydrates and load carbohydrates and replenish your carbohydrates because it was the most efficient fuel. It was not even negotiable at the time that there was another pathway. But certainly over the last probably 5 to 10 years, work of Steve Phinney, 1984, was probably buried for 30 years before people started to pay attention to it. But now you're seeing people at the world-class level, performing on low carbohydrate diets, ketogenic diets, not just at a recreational level, but at a world-class level. I think with the just abundance of diabetes and metabolic syndrome in the general population who are participating now in events. So if you go to your local 5K or even marathon, that group of people isn't different than a group that would be, walking down the street or in my medical clinic. So these aren't necessarily, elite or world-class athletes. These are just normal people living normal lives, and a lot of them have the same metabolic conditions. So for their health, they're learning that, wow, there is another option. I've got pre-diabetes or diabetes, and now someone told me to run. I'm a runner, but maybe I need to fix how I eat for my unique metabolism. So yeah, the science has just evolved too, and I know you've had Jeff Wolek and Steve Phinney, on the show and involved with UCAN, but many thanks to Steve and Jeff. I mean, Jeff's published about 400 papers, Steve 200. They've written books. So these guys have done the hard, heavy work that allows someone like me just to share what they've done in the lab and with runners and patients.
And Mark, I think sort of purposefully in the title of this discussion today, we did want to emphasize health, over performance. Can you just speak to that? I mean, I guess seems obvious when you boil it down to say, without health, everything else is irrelevant, but it's easy to forget that, how much is that something that you try to emphasize in all, as you're dealing with, athletes in so many different ways, that health is really what has to come first?
Oh my gosh, I mean, I think that's it. I mean, without that, it's a house of cards. And, I owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Phil Maffetone. And for anyone listening, just purchase any of his books, A Big Book of Endurance Training and Racing, or The Big Book of Health and Wellness. So I picked up a book that Phil had written in 1990 called In Fitness and in Health. I was just starting to learn a little more about exercise physiology. I had all these running injuries and some surgeries, and we're just trying to get out of the hole. This is about year 2000. I picked up this book by Dr. Phil Maffetone called In Fitness and in Health, and it talked about fit but not healthy. So if you go out there and look at even high-level performers, you know, their general health sometimes is not good, and they destroy themselves in pursuit of performance. And we see that too often, especially in, you know, high-level collegiate athletes, females, eating disorders, stress fractures. So they're sacrificing their health to get fit. So his work was eye-opening, and just read any of his work and it'll all make sense to you, whether you're an athlete or a non-athlete. So if you don't have health, the fitness doesn't matter. It's very short-lived. You know, I take pride. So this year was the 30th consecutive year I ran a marathon under 3 hours. And it's from a couple of years from the Guinness Book of World Records there. There's one guy, he's at 33 years, but his streak's over. So it's not about the speed or how fast you go, but it's really about, okay, you can wake up the next day after that marathon and you feel good. You haven't really done any damage. And that's what I'm trying to share with people. Get yourself healthy, and the rest of it's all good, and you'll achieve whatever fitness that you want for your goal.
So it's a great perspective, Mark. You know, we're out at expos or running stores all the time and talking to, you know, hundreds or thousands of athletes. And really the most common thing we hear is that people are in the sport to get fit, to stay fit, and for longevity, to keep enjoying the sport and being able to do the sport for as long as they can. So everything you're going to talk to us about today is you know, very relevant in terms of furthering that goal. So with that, Mark, I want to turn it over to you here in just a moment. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes for folks in the audience, and really want to thank everyone again for joining us live today and for signing up. I know you won't regret it, having talked to Mark before, but if you do want access to these slides or this video, we will be sending both this entire deck as well as the entire video out after a little bit later tonight. So don't stress. Don't feel like you have to capture every single thing Mark says. If you're a note taker, you will have access to all the information later on. And along the course of the way, if you do have questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. If they're relevant to what we're talking about, we'll chat with Mark about them in between. If not, we'll try our best to address them at the end. And one final note, for those of you that want to learn about UCAN and how it relates to all this, we will be chatting about that closer towards the end of the webinar. So Mark, with that, I will turn it over to you. Take it away.
Okay, so for those of you out there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly through a few objectives here. I'm going to go to my next slide. Let's go to the page down. So these are, I'm going to tell you a little bit about type 2 diabetes and diabetes remission. So can you reverse type 2 diabetes? A little bit about disruptive technology, what that is, and my personal journey, because most of what's happening here with the low carb, high fat movement in sports is disruptive to what we've all believed to be true. Low carb for performance and athletics. A little bit about diabetes and obesity treatments through history, because this will help you learn about insulin and insulin science, and then how, you know, if you're in a community now, I'm in West Virginia, and you'll learn a little bit about that. So I don't really care about how people do in their 5Ks or marathons, honestly. We're in an obesity and diabetes crisis. That's my main goal. And this really does take a community. And I'm finding even a group like this, you're listening online. So, you know, the social media and online community helps give people the support they need. And so reach out to others who might need help, you know, even if they're, you know, half country away. So on that, we'll kind of get kicked off here. So, you know, I think everyone in sports knows this. The human body is centuries ahead of the physiologist. So don't wait for the authorities to tell you that what is working for your body is true, because if you feel good, it's good. And I've heard this a lot, and I'll have people argue, and I don't think it's an argument, because each of us is an individual. So is there one perfect human diet? And, you know, absolutely not. But you're you, and I'm me, and what's the best diet for you is what's important. So diabetes, certainly, this is the full catastrophe. Over $300 billion in the U.S. alone. Now, the NASA budget, I believe, comes in at about $18 million, just to give that some perspective. Yes, more money is spent on diabetes than on all of national defense in America. So this is I mean, how does this end? And that's what we're going to talk about today. You know, how are we going to get on top of this? So yeah, and we're not winning. So diabetes and obesity are undefeated. You know, everything you read, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. Okay, this shouldn't surprise anyone. At childhood obesity, you know, you do have a higher rate of type 2 diabetes. They're very similar in their physiology of insulin resistance. Now here's where I live, 2015 state well-being, we're number 50, so we're kind of low-hanging fruit, which is good news for us. We can only go up, so I think this is a fascinating video. Maybe there's videos of your own city, even if you're somewhere over down under, so there's a video online from Charleston, West Virginia, 1981-82, if you just Google that. And it just is a camera for about 10 minutes panning around the city. And it's almost like you've gone to Mars, because there's no obese people. Where are they? And if you go to Charleston, West Virginia now, and it's pretty hard to find someone who's not obese. So something dramatically has happened in less than 40 years. And I don't have the full explanation for that, but as Steve Jobs says, you can only connect the dots going backwards. So we've got to look backwards about how we got here and then try to come up with some new ideas. So I think we're talking about a couple different things. And I want people to understand what BMI is and then being over fat. So we all these CDC measurements talk about body mass index. Now that's just a measure of your weight and your height in a proportion. Now if I'm in the NFL and a strength training athlete, I'm going to be obese by the CDC terms. But I could also be lean by the CDC terms, but have metabolic syndrome because I'm carrying too much body fat. So that would be like if I had pencil legs and this big belly, pencil arms, no torso, and they'd say, oh, your BMI is okay, so you're okay, but technically you're over fat. So I think Phil Maffetone really defined this with Paul Larson. They published this about 6 months ago. Over fat is really the problem, and this is bad belly fat. Maybe it's up to, gosh, almost 3/4 of the world right now is over fat. Bad body fat in the wrong places. Now here's another thing I just want people to remember. So the word fat tends to be like an F word, it's all bad, but that's not true, because we do have good fat. So our subcutaneous fat, which is called brown fat, is metabolically active. So if you went up to any kind of northern territories or up in Alaska, these people have pretty robust body fats, but it's metabolically active. It keeps them warm. They don't have diabetes. This is called brown fat. It's filled with mitochondria, filled with capillaries. So that is not bad fat. Now, fat in the middle in your belly sets off multiple inflammatory cascades. So that is the fat you don't want, is that fat around the middle. So if someone says they're 15 or 18 or 24% body fat, I want to know where it is. So there's more we need to know about this. So you can read about that. There's a lot been written in the last 5 years on these two types of fat. But let's talk a little bit about diabetes. Because if you follow, the expert advice or standards of care, diabetes is a chronic complex illness needing continual medical care, multifactorial reduction strategies beyond glycemic control. It's a chronic progressive disease that needs intensive medical management. That's from the ADA, American Diabetes Association. Now, does that sound like someplace you want to be? You're 40 years old and you have this chronic progressive disease that you need multiple specialists and testing involved. I would argue that no, that's not. Let's get the heck out of that trap. Let's reverse this. But okay, is it reversible? If you look at Kaiser data, this is about 120,000 patients. About 1%, less than 1% actually, will have any spontaneous remission. Your odds of dying during this cohort were greater than your odds of diabetes remission. So if you follow Kaiser's data, no, you can't. No one reverses this. You're just going to die. And I don't have the slide for this, but a company, Virta now, is doing some early work. They just published their 10-week results, and they're about to publish their 6th. Steve Finney and Jeff Volek are involved in Virta, about to publish their 6-month data showing that, yes, you can reverse the diabetes with a low-carbohydrate diet. And maybe, Varun, we could share that link to just Virta Health on the site, because their goal is to reverse diabetes in 100 million around the world by 2025. And it's a bold goal, but I'm on board with those guys. They can do it if we all work together. So here is kind of what the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, American Medical Association, and the American Diabetes Association have on their public website on reversing or halting pre-diabetes. And I question this. I mean, we have to question. We have to be skeptics, and we have to inquire, how do they get this science or non-science? So if you go to this page here, and this is available, pushed out to the general public, so you have pre-diabetes, or you're at risk for pre-diabetes, meaning everyone in your family's got it, you got weight in the middle. So this is what they talk about on their lifestyle page as far as nutrition. Cut down on foods with saturated fat or trans fat. in the same sentence, like they're both the same thing and bad. Hydrogenated fat or partially hydrogenated fat. Choose foods with less sodium than your usual choices. Keep track of fat grams and calorie intake. There's not a single word or sentence on that page about carbohydrate content of what you're eating. Now, if you go to their scientific papers, they say this: carbohydrates that you ingest are the main driver of your blood glucose. So I'm trying to figure this out. I say, okay, carbohydrates drive my blood glucose up, which is glucose intolerance, which will lead to diabetes. But yet they don't tell me to at least consider as an option. I mean, you could drive on either side of the road and see how that's working for you. But I've been practicing medicine for, over 20 years, 25 years now. Golly, how's this working for you? If I gave that advice to any pre-diabetic and followed them for 5 years, it's not going to work. It just doesn't. So that's just what people are seeing. So you out there need to be smarter than your doctor and the CDC. So I'm giving you permission to do that. It's okay. It's an open access world now. 20 years ago, you just trusted what the guy or the gal in the white coat said, and they were usually all guys at that time. But now it's, yeah, you can be your own doctor. Just get some good advice. Maybe we can help you with some of that, through some of the resources we share. So here's kind of my short story about how I figured this out. So, I figured this out, because I was doing everything wrong, and I think we have to admit we were doing everything wrong. So 10 years ago, I told all my patients who needed to lose weight, they needed to burn more than they eat, they needed to cut back on fat, they needed to exercise more, and it took a lot of willpower, because that's what we all believed. But this is what I tell people now. I actually walk into patient rooms with this graphic, and I love this graphic because they're at a fork in the road. So for example, last night I was on call and I had 3 patients who had myocardial infarctions come through the ER, and then they all had diabetes, because basically heart disease and diabetes are the same thing. So yeah, they're there, and this is what they need to know. Okay, there's a fork in the road here. If you just go the standard route, you can be a medical patient for life, inject insulin, take all these pills, take the statins, do all this stuff, or there is a road that you can get healthy. Do you want to know about that road? And I'd say probably 95% of people say, yeah, just tell me about that. And you'll explain it to them, and most say, oh, we'll give that a try at least. Whether they'll adhere to it is their decision, but at least they need to know there is an option. If they don't know there's an option, then they'll never get out of the trap. So I'd like that, but we defer, and I'm a family doc, and where the experts disagree, the ignorant are free to choose, and maybe that's how people in America view family practitioners, because they say, oh, these guys are just the gatekeepers or something. That's how the insurance companies view us. But I like this quote. It's from a book, Zen, the Beginner's Mind. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, the possibilities are few. So I think all of us need to open our minds to new possibilities. So here's a paradigm of modern medicine. Controlling medicine. So I'm a military doc too, and if I'm in a trauma, I think the U.S. healthcare system is awesome. They're going to take full control over everything, and they're going to save your life. Military trauma, we're the best in the world at saving soldiers, who have traumatic injuries on the battlefield. But I teach medical students and residents, but what they're learning is mostly this number 2 here, which is substitutive. Meaning I got a headache, take a pill. I have high blood pressure, take a pill. Diabetes, take a pill. Cholesterol, take a pill. Whatever your symptom is, heartburn, take a pill, and pretty soon you're on 10 medications. But for chronic disease, which really is about 80% of our healthcare burden now, we have to look at it from this catalytic approach, meaning support the body and empower it to reverse and heal disease. Some people call that naturopathic, or complementary medicine. I don't know what you call it, but let's use natural things. There's a lot of, I think charlatanism in this space too, people trying to sell products and gizmos and their own nutritional supplements. So you need to be your own doctor. There's nothing I have to sell here that you can't do with your own body. So most people are not aware of what is wrong. So if we cannot change what we are not aware of, we cannot change what we are not aware of, but once we are aware, we cannot help but change. So it's pretty fascinating in my community when people actually understand, wow, the sugar's driving my sugar up. If I don't eat sugar, it drives it down. I can do that. And then they're on their way. So, if this might be you, maybe you have pre-diabetes or you treat people, I think at first you must disrupt yourself before you kind of start passing this on to others. So a little my pathway in disruption was, I was a runner and believed everything about running, caused injuries, and we needed these big shoes. And so this was my first journey, was in the year 2000. This is 1999. I'm 2000. Had my feet operated on. You see my toes are bent inwards. My feet look like track spikes. Told not to run, but I quickly realized that most of what we had learned in medical school and sports medicine was backwards. So I went and did my own reading. Started running barefoot even before Born to Run came out. And here's Chris McDougall. He's a friend in the background. We're doing barefoot seminars in 2008. And that running surgery I had back in 2000 was my last running injury, so knock on wood, things will keep going well there. But, so here's the health side of it. But my family, this is my father. He's still alive. He had his first MI at 35, a bypass, another at 45. A lot of pre-diabetes, diabetes runs through my family. Here's him on the beach, reading the New Atkins for a New Year. Here's Cucuzella's Bakery. So my genes are designed to go down this path. So how can you be fit and not healthy? So this is me in 2006. I was pretty darn fit. This was winning the Air Force Marathon. But my labs at that time were not reflecting really good health. My fasting glucose was 120s, triglycerides over 200, HDL 40. And we'll talk about those a little bit later, but they're far from optimal. Here's 2011. This is after I'd started, reducing carbohydrates, eating more fat, a little less fit, running a little slower, about age 45 at the time. But man, I felt better. Didn't wake up at 2 in the morning every morning needing cereal. Wasn't hangry all the time. Had energy all day, had mental clarity. But this was really as I was developing insulin resistance, and maybe some of you, this is the way it is. I couldn't make it more than probably 4 to 6 hours without a huge bout of carbohydrates, meaning salad, like mixing bowls full of cereal and skim milk, because my insulin levels were so high I couldn't access body fat at all. So it was like clockwork, cereal before bed, 3 in the morning more cereal, 7 in the morning more cereal, snack bars, bagels, 24/7, until I did realize I had metabolic syndrome and the beginnings of pre-diabetes back then. So now this is 2017, so certainly not as fit, run a little slower, managed under 3 hours at the Boston Marathon this year in these little running sandals. But I've become kind of a human experiment, and I've volunteered for a lot of different studies on aging runners. But now my HDL is 106, which is really high. The most important ratio here you want is your HDL to triglyceride ratio. So you want your HDL higher than your triglycerides. LDL, my LDL is pretty low, but what's more important, my A1C now is down to about 5.5 from a high of 6.3. All these inflammatory markers we measure in the lab are just -0, and what's called a coronary artery calcium score, which is the amount of plaque in your coronary arteries, is 0. I even had one of these kind of weird telomere tests done. These are like the new age test, which kind of measure your DNA strands, like by your DNA, are you 50, 60, 70 or younger? So I'm 15 years younger, at least by my DNA. So I'll take that. We'll see what happens. Go get up. My truck tomorrow out running. That's a nice thing to know. I mean, line up. Go ahead.
Yeah, one question for you on this, and a couple of people in the audience were asking this. So, you were talking about being fit but not healthy, being an accomplished runner, winning some races. How surprised were you when you found out you had metabolic syndrome? Was this something that really took you aback or struck you as really surprising?
When I first, I didn't know it because no one was talking about this. So I'd go in for my physicals, and I'd have these labs like this, and I didn't learn or read about this stuff either. So oh, you're fit, right? You're like winning races. So if I showed up in the clinic 300 pounds with those labs, they probably would have said something was wrong. So I had to look back. So I went back I started to read about low carbohydrate, look back at my labs, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've had this back in 3-4 years before I even realized that I had it. So now I think people are more aware, at least physicians who are astute to this, but I would say 90% of patients I see have prediabetes and metabolic syndrome and have no clue they have it. Even though you open their labs and you're like, your A1C is 6 and your triglycerides are 300 and your HDL is 30 and you have high blood pressure. Do you know you have this thing called the metabolic syndrome and prediabetes? And they look at you like, like you're from outer space, give you the head, well, what do you mean by that? Or they say, yeah, someone said I had a little of something, but they don't, it's not actionable. They don't really have insight into it.
And I think as you
so
pointed
maybe
out,
we're a little better, but I think we're in the dark ages of identifying these people early, before they have their first heart attack.
Yeah, and I guess, in telling your own story, as you pointed out, like this is very reversible, right? So
Very
in that context, the early detection is even more important because there are many tangible things you can do to correct this.
totally. Yeah, when you have full beta cell failure of your pancreas, then it's much harder to reverse. So people have been diabetic 20 or 30 years. So we want to catch people early and fix their metabolism, which is not complex. It's a, pretty simple thing to do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that.
Yeah, so let's go a little bit into the sports side of this, and then I'll get a little more into the health side of it. So here's kind of a little bit of my story. Can you run a marathon at age 50, under 3 hours, barefoot in sandals on a low carbohydrate diet? So here's Marine Corps Marathon last year in the sandals, low carbohydrate diet, and felt good. And my son looked at these down here in the lower right-hand corner, kind of my splits along the way. It was a pretty warm day. It was about 70 to 75 degrees. But he looked at those splits, you see the pace per mile, and he said, Dad, that's freakish. But this is what happens when you're on a low carbohydrate diet. There's no bonk. You actually gain energy as the race progresses. So this is what to expect if you dial this in. You're just like a metronome. You just clock it in. Here's a 50-mile race I did last fall. Again, just running very even pace the whole way. Feeling good. Never afraid you're going to bonk or run out of gas. I mean, a lot of things can go wrong over 50 miles of trail. But if you have your nutrition dialed in, that's one big variable that's not going to go wrong. And then you have the confidence in it. So I'm in the military too, but so here's what the military is pushing out. So look at this. This is the Athlete's Guide to Everyday Nutrient Timing. So this, I'm talking now about what's conventionally put out, and then I'll explain the other side of the road. So eat jam and jelly, have a muffin, drink sports drinks, low-fat yogurt, chocolate milk, which has, gosh, like 20 teaspoons of sugar, fruit, sports drinks, all kinds of stuff, all of it high, high, high. I mean, this is probably about 600 to 800 grams of carbohydrates on this. But no kidding, if you read every new publication out in the military times, sir, we have a problem. The military is becoming more obese. But going back to this, because this is my opinion, because they're following this advice. This advice might work for the 18-year-old Marine recruit who's out moving 10 hours a day, but the master sergeant doing a desk job, it ain't working for him. But yeah, so not everyone needs to be a low carbohydrate runner or athlete. So these are two friends who are just amazing world-class performers, Mike Wardian and Jim Walmsley. These guys can burn carbs like nobody's business and are performing at the top of their game. If you read some of the common stuff out there, but I think it's misinformed. So Matt Fitzgerald, he's a nutritionist, wrote a book called The Endurance Diet. This is what he has to say. Sad to say, the rising popularity of low-carb diet among recreational endurance athletes has been very good for my business. No references, but he wrote his book on the premise. He interviewed 60 world-class athletes and asked them what they ate. And sure enough, they ate a lot of carbs. But does that mean that the 50-year-old 240-pound 5Ker is the same as that Norwegian cross-country skier skiing? No, they're completely different metabolic machines. So to draw your conclusion on what the world class are doing and apply that to anyone else, I think is short-sighted. Here's another, I mean, wow, think about this. So Liz Applegate writes this for Runner's World. She's a PhD. Took 3 athletes who are high-end world-class ultra runners, asked them what they ate. They all ate a lot of carbs. So that means that that's the best way to go. I disagree. 3. No, I speak at the Boston Marathon every year at a sports med conference, and I'll give my disruptive stuff. And then this was the kind of status quo from Nancy Clark, who's also published a lot of sports nutrition. So she bases her nutritional wisdom on what the Kenyans are doing. So here's a 20-year-old Kenyan running 140 mile a week. They eat 375 to 975 grams of carbs a day, and they run like the wind. So therefore, the person in the audience there running 5 hours should be doing that. Now just think about this. I mean, we're evolutionary species, or maybe if you don't believe in evolution and you're on the creation side, we're designed, and some higher being made us. But I honestly don't believe the human species is designed to eat 900 grams of carbohydrates for an entire lifetime. I mean, no time in the history of our existence have we ever come close to that for extended durations of time. I mean, maybe you had some short windfall of a harvest or something, and then you had 6 months of famine. But so this is not sustainable for life. Okay, so here's what Nancy also says. Okay, if you want to lose weight, let's just cut calories and burn more, calories in, calories out. And of course, if you don't replenish carbohydrates, you're going to deplete your glycogen stores. Not a single reference to what Richard Wood is saying here in a minute, but what if you can actually access fat as fuel? That's the question, and that's what people aren't talking about, because then you have this other whole engine that you don't need the added carbohydrates or even a high glycogen tank. So it's kind of like this, you take the blue pill, the story ends. This is from The Matrix, or you take the red pill and you enter Wonderland. So people that take on low carbohydrate diets for sports performance, it is like taking the red pill, I think, and they need to know that this isn't a 2-week experiment. I think Louise Burke, who's held out as a world authority, just published a paper on a 3-week intervention of a low carbohydrate diet for athletes and showed it really didn't work well for high-end performance, therefore it doesn't work. I mean, it's almost laughable. 3 weeks? I mean, what the heck? You're talking 3 years for many people before they really fully dial this in. So, I think that's far from evidence that low carbohydrate diet is debunking for the birds. So here's Richard Wood. He's working with Verta now, and he gave the counter to Nancy Clark at the Boston Marathon. So here it is. So you can either rely on glycogen and eat glycogen and glucose and prevent it from going too low, or you could reduce your reliance on glycogen, meaning being fat adapted. So our bodies, even the leanest Kenyan, is probably carrying 40,000 calories of fat on their body at the starting line of the Boston Marathon, maybe 1,800 calories of carbohydrates. And you do the math. I mean, it's going to take you more than 18 calories to get to the finish line. It's a 26-mile race. So you need to be able to tap into that fat tank. These are the books. Read them. This is a Reader's Digest version. Read both of these books. They have all the science. And read about what Dr. Tim Noakes is doing in South Africa. So this is Tim and I about 4 years ago when I was down doing the Comrades Marathon. And I didn't know that he was kind of looking at the same thing. So Tim got Dr. Noakes, who's the preeminent sports scientist on the planet, who was writing about the high carbohydrate diet for athletes, came out and said, you need to tear out the chapter of the Lore of Running because I think I got it all wrong. So he was the first to say, look, I'm wrong. Let's look at this. And he was talking about nutrition, and I was talking about this stuff in America. So it was great to hear him speak because I didn't know he had really kind of gone into this hole that deep. But yeah, he was actually brought up to trial in South Africa because he had the gall to tell a mother that it's safe to wean the baby from breast milk, which is high-fat, low-carb, to a high-fat, low-carb diet. And he was acquitted, had 1,800 pages of evidence as opposed to the opinion of the other side who was trying to revoke his license, and he won by a 10-0 jury verdict. So Dr. Noakes was just in America too. I think you could find his video. He was at a CrossFit seminar in Wisconsin just a few days ago. I need to listen to that, but he'll share his story. Let's go back a little bit. So Tour de France just finished. So Jacques Anquetil, 5 Tours de France. This was his diet: steak, lobster, and champagne. And many people out there have read about Froome, Chris Froome. So he's on a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet, and now he's won 4 Tour de France titles, and he'll be going after number 5 next year. During the tour itself, certainly he's tapping into more carbohydrates when these 100-mile stages, but he's adapted his body to burn fat. Took about 20 pounds off his frame, and if you're climbing up, the Col de Gabriel, you need to have a little less mass, a little more power. So that's certainly worked for him over the last 4 years. This is Amanda Stevens. That's an Ironman, full Ironman, under 9 hours. She's a physician, and she works with Phil Maffetone, and she was only taking in 100 calories an hour during a full Ironman, became completely fat adapted. She was constantly struggling with GI issues, which is really the big, if any, ultra marathoners out there. The main reason people DNF in ultras is their stomach goes. And that happened to me my first ultra. Before I understood this, I just started throwing up at about mile 25 of a 50-mile race. And when your stomach goes, you cannot get it back. And this was happening frequently to Amanda. You train for 6 months and you try to eat 400 calories during the event, and your stomach goes because it's hot and your pulse is up, and it's like, wow, like you just blew it, right? So now she's completely dialed in on a low-carb diet and kicking butt. That's under 9 hours in an Ironman. Age 35 too. Here's a couple other just amazing performers. Timothy Olson, that's under 15 hours at the Western States. I believe that's still a course record. Zach Bitter, he can run 7 minutes a mile for 100 miles. He can burn fat recorded greater than any human, I think, ever recorded. You'd have to confirm that with Jeff Volek. Mike Morton, 24-hour distance record, low carb athlete. It's not just humans. Look at how birds migrate 7,000 miles without a power bar. They lose half of their weight, which is body fat, during this migration. Jeff Volek talks about the mighty sled dogs too. They certainly are eating the prototypical low-carb diet. They're just eating a lot of steak, but these dogs are running 100 miles a day at 8 minutes a mile. They have this massive VO2 max, but they can burn fat like crazy. So you got to get in the lab if you really want to know what's happening to you, and I love being a subject in these laboratory studies. This is a VO2 max test here, and I'll show you some results here in a minute. But I'm going to talk about a couple things that we look at on a VO2 max test if some of you out there have had one of these done. So on a VO2 max test, they can look at what's called the respiratory exchange ratio, that's where we're looking at the ratio of carbon dioxide expiration. So the more carbohydrates we burn, the higher that carbon dioxide component of our expired gas. And there's this point where we flip from mostly fat metabolism to more carbohydrate metabolism. The more intense your exercise goes, the more you're going to flip over to carbohydrate metabolism. Now, another way to think about this practically, if you don't have a lab, it's called the ventilatory threshold. Now, how I explain that to people is most of us kind of know, like if you're out on a group run, you're chatting away, talking, gossiping, breathing through your nose, you're totally mellow, then someone decides to pick it up a little bit, and now all of a sudden, respiratory rate picks up, people aren't talking anymore. That's above your ventilatory threshold because you're producing more carbon dioxide, which is glucose utilization. So at that point, you're just burning sugar. So at that ventilatory threshold, you want to do most of your training below that ventilatory threshold. A lab will confirm it for you, but if you just have a good intuition of your breathing, if you can breathe through your nose, you're below it. So before the FASTER study, which was Jeff Volek's study, it was believed that the human organism could only burn maybe at max 1 gram of fat a minute. Therefore, if you needed high intensity, you had to go to carbohydrates because you were limited by how much fat you could burn. It takes a little more oxygen. Higher intensity, got to go to carbs. But okay, that was in the textbooks. But then this study showed up, amazing. It was called the Fat Adapted Substrate Oxidation in Trained Elite Runners. So they were matched, these were all male runners. So for the ladies out there, maybe this is relevant to female physiology, but I don't think we can draw complete conclusions. But this was young, 30-ish-year-old elite male endurance runners who had been on low carbohydrate diets not for 3 weeks. I think the average was about 18 months. So these folks had been on low carbohydrate diets for quite a bit of time. So this is before that study, this is a cohort of athletes, and none of them even touched 1 gram a minute. They're all kind of about 0.5 grams a minute, therefore they shift to carbohydrates. And this is one thing, whether you're a high carb or low carb athlete, the fitter you are, the more you do have a capacity to burn fat. So even if you're someone who is on a high carbohydrate diet, if you're very fit, your body trains itself to burn fat. For example, the Kenyans who don't eat a low carbohydrate diet, they can still burn fat like a beast, especially early stages of a marathon race. So here's what happens. So insulin is a very powerful hormone. Insulin inhibits fat oxidation. So if your insulin is up, you can't burn fat. So for someone who's constantly eating carbohydrates before, during, after runs, you really can't tap in to those fat stores. Or if you're someone who has diabetes or metabolic syndrome and your insulin is just up all day, you just can't burn fat. So you've got to get your insulin down to burn fat. These were the subjects. You could look at the slides later, 33, 34 years old. All of them had a VO2 max, 64 to 65 range. Many national champs in this group. Body mass index is very lean. These were the diets that they ate, the habitual diets, and so the high carb group, 60% carbs. And these were healthy high carb diets. Some of them had really healthy plant-based diets. Low carb diets, these were going to be mostly high healthy fat diets, low carbohydrate diets with adequate protein. This is a very interesting slide. So this is max intensity. So as we dial up here, you kind of see my arrow here going 20%. That's kind of like walking the dog. 100% is all out. None of them got that like all out 100%. So the high carbohydrate diet performers, as their intensity rose, they hit like what's called a fat max. So my arrow here is on the fat max. So this is the maximum capacity they have to burn fat. They're at 50% of their maximum intensity, and they're about 5.5 grams a minute. Now look at these low-carb athletes. They're at 80% intensity, burning 1.2 gram a minute. So they're like running really close to lactate threshold. That'd be like a tempo pace or like marathon pace. So they're running really fast, burning fat, where if you look at, you know, say a half marathon or marathon where you're running pretty close to your tempo pace, you know, lactate threshold pace, you're burning sugar. So you better be able to burn sugar pretty well or have a lot of sugar stores, or else you're going to run out of gas. So here's in the study. So this was interesting too. Here's the cohorts. So even the best of the high carb athletes were burning less fat than the least of the low carb athletes, were an average of 1.54 grams a minute. So this isn't in the textbook. So this rewrites the textbook here. This group that has been living this way for 18 months is burning more fat than is in the exercise physiology textbooks. So here's a 3-hour submax test. So you look at the 3-hour test. So if you look at the high carb athlete, they start to tap into a little more fat later on in the run once they start to run out of sugar. But the the high fat athlete burning fat the whole time. Really interesting. This group also, surprisingly to the authors of the paper, maintained their glycogen stores. And you have to read the paper, the discussion about why they think that is. But so the body does a really good job of conserving glycogen, even in a fat-adapted state. But a couple other things from a health side that I think were important in looking at this study, because insulin resistance is a powerful marker of future disease. So this here is the low carb group. So they have very low, this LPIR score is a lab value. It's called an NMR lipid test, but it'll put together a bunch of your test variables and show you how insulin resistant you are, insulin sensitive. So this group was very insulin sensitive, and the high carb group was becoming more insulin resistant. So for general health, this group is healthier. Let's just look at cholesterol, some common things that the docs tell you are important. So the low-carb athletes actually did have a little slightly higher LDL cholesterol, but there's more to the LDL story than this being bad cholesterol, as we'll talk about in a second here. The high-carb athletes, a little lower LDL, but the HDL powerfully high, like look at these averages, 100, you know, even a couple up here like 130, like highest ever recorded of HDL cholesterols. HDL cholesterols in the the low-fat group were pretty good, but certainly not up at these levels. Total cholesterol values, pretty same, but this is some of the emerging literature on cholesterol, so these particle size. So LDL is not all bad cholesterol. So we have what we call good bad cholesterol and bad cholesterol. So small LDLs are bad, good, large LDLs are good. So the low carb athletes had really big, large, fluffy LDLs. So just because their total LDL calculated was high, this was not a bad thing. They had low particle numbers and big fluffy LDL. So they had what I would call, and Tim Noakes says the same thing, they had good bad cholesterol. All right, here's Meb. I had the privilege of meeting Meb before the Air Force Marathon this year, and we shared, this is my shake, you know, maybe this was about 30 minutes before the race. This was a little bit of the protein, SuperStarch, and Meb was jumping into the 10K, and then he was going to go out for another training run, but he shared a little bit about how he eats, and now that he's 40 years old, he eats different than he did when he was 20. He's become more insulin resistant. He's African by genetics, so he knows that his family genes are going to send him in that direction. So yeah, he's probably not uber low carb because he's doing a lot of glycolytic workouts, but certainly he has shifted how he eats and how he uses his race day fuel. So let's talk a little bit about kind of how my tests go and how this works as you adapt your body into a low carbohydrate state. So this is January 2016. Now I'd been low carbohydrate for quite a few years, maybe 4 years, but I was, at this time of my life, I was doing a ton of night call, sleep deprived. There's a lot of things that contribute to insulin resistance. But when you go into an exercise lab, they'll pull out some lines here as you start to run with the air exchange. This is called the AET, which is the aerobic threshold. This AT is what we technically call the lactate threshold. This is where we build up acidity. And peak over here is VO2 max. So this peak is the max. So below this line is below that ventilatory threshold. So here's where you're burning mostly fat, start to shift to glucose into this range. So in 2016, at about a VO2 max of 30, or VO2 of 34, which is pretty good, heart rate of 134, I start to shift into more glucose. I could burn about 1.1 gram per minute of fat, um, which was okay. I mean, I'm 50 or 49 at the time, still have a VO2 max. And then I stuck with the diet for another year, and I think I got my sleep figured out a little bit more. But this was 2017, just a few months back. So this AET zone, again, like you're having a conversation, you're burning butter. So I'm burning fat now up to a heart rate of 168 and a VO2 of 55. So this is really close to lactate threshold burning fat, and I still had about the same peak. So 60 VO2 max is 64.6, that's about the same, but almost at full speed burning fat. And when you do the calculations, it's about 1.9 gram per minute. But I think what Steve Finney pointed this out when he looked at the results, because I didn't really notice this right away either. So let's go back to this one. So if any of y'all have done a VO2 max test, I mean, they gas you. You pretty much run till you put the hand at your throat and say, "Uncle," and stop. So at 1 minute, my heart rate is still, 179. I'm still pretty jacked up. But this year, 178, pretty close to the same max heart rate, but in 1 minute down to 113, which is like walking the dog. So you recover amazingly fast. So somewhere between 2016 and 2017, at least my body made some changes. But I'd probably been insulin resistant for years. So when people think it's a 3-week thing, respectfully, they're wrong. This could be a 3 to 4 year thing before you really dial it in. We're starting to use this in the military now. Every time I give a course, we want people to slow their running down and eat less sugar. Here's a little bit of my race day strategy. So this is before a 50-mile race. So this 50 miles, you need to get some calories in you. So here's my breakfast. So, here's a little SuperStarch. I love the hydrate because you need the sodium. This is a beautiful product instead of the free water. But sure, I'll get a little carb. I'll load it with some nut butter. And my friend Peter Defty has a wonderful product here for people that are fat adapted called Vespa. Out on the course, so I don't drink free water. If I'm going to drink water, I'm going to get the sodium and magnesium in there. So this is my little handheld. These are the hydrates. I love the bars. I'll use the UCAN bars, a little Vespa, but that's pretty much it. And, probably about 100 calories an hour at the most, and, mixing the hydrate with the water. But this is how you practice in your training. Figure out what works best for you, but you're never worried that your stomach's going to go, if this is your race on-course meal, this stuff is so easy to stomach, and this stuff is so easy to stomach. You're fine. You're going to be good. Recovery. I think this is probably the one thing I've learned about low carb athletics is you just recover. You wake up the next day and you're never sore. You're never feeling like you're in the tank. You just feel good. It's kind of like this. If you have a Tesla and your exhaust versus a charger and your exhaust, I would consider the Tesla electric, meaning fat oxidation, and the glucose burning is more like a gas oxidation. So you have different byproducts that happen in the Krebs cycle from these two metabolisms. And the fat oxidation is a much cleaner burn fuel. So all of this, all of us have felt sore and tired. So you have to try this. This stuff just goes away. It's weird. It just goes away. And that's not just me. If you talk to anyone who's done this for, not just 2 weeks, months and years, they're like, "Oh yeah, this recovery, what do you mean by that?" You don't damage yourself. So if you don't damage yourself, you don't need to recover. We're going to fly through a few things that have to do with insulin and medicine, just so people understand insulin, because insulin is not a bad thing. So before type 1, before insulin was developed in the 1920s, this was type 1 diabetes. They would eat 10,000 calories a day and they would waste, because without insulin you can't store. It's a storage hormone. It was called diabetes of starvation. And then you develop insulin therapy, and here's the same child 4 months later on insulin therapy. Yeah, they save their lives. But before insulin, all the diabetics didn't die immediately. They actually all went on these low carbohydrate diets because it was the only way that they could survive. 10 grams carbs, a lot of fat, protein. This was Osler's textbook of medicine, 1923. So this isn't new therapy. This is just pre-insulin era. William Osler, this is a textbook of medicine. So this was the treatment of diabetes. You can kind of look up here, similar things. Foods to eat, these are all the nice leafy greens, a few fruits, foods, strict diet foods without sugar. Look at up here. And then foods to avoid are pretty much everything That's all the farinaceous foods, they call them, so no grains or any type of flours. And this is how they treated the diabetics. So here's for obesity, 1954, Pennington was considered the world's authority. This diet contains no bread, flour, or sugar. Diet for Obesity, 1951. This was the premier endocrine text. Foods to be avoided. You can read the list. Bread, cereals, potatoes. Sugars, foods containing sugar, all sweets. Foods you can eat. Meat, fish, birds, all green vegetables, eggs, dried or fresh, cheese, fruit, except bananas or grapes. And those of you following low carb or ketogenic, this is pretty much the same food list you'll see now. Saccharin disease, this was it was a book published in the 1970s. Clear evidence that ill health appear in pre-industrial communities immediately after the introduction of sugar, flour, other refined carbohydrates. There is no proven link to any sudden increase in habitual fat intake. Type 1 and type 2, so they started to notice there were two different types of diabetes. So diabetes is diagnosed by your blood sugar, so the type 1s were all wasting. They didn't have insulin, but then people started to develop this type 2. That was called the fatty diabetes. They looked different. They had big bellies, but they would have high sugars. But they had the opposite problem, so they have too much insulin. And actually, because they're insulin resistant, their cells are starving. So the remedies are different. So the type 1s, you got to give insulin, but the type 2s, you got to reverse it and reduce insulin. So when did this all start? So where did we start to get this wrong? In 1976 was the first Dietary Advisory Committee, which turned into the Dietary Guidelines for America, which many of you all who are my age remember as the food pyramid, which was hung up in our grade schools, which told us to eat less fat, more carbohydrates. So we followed that advice, actually. So we did follow the government advice. We ignored your grandmother at that time, who was eating bacon and eggs and cheese and butter, and we listened to the government, who told us not to eat that stuff, and the world became obese. And as we started to reduce the fat. But if you look now, I think the authorities continue just to double down. They still tell you fat is bad, and I'm not following it. So you're out there, you become your own doctor, make your own decision. So I think maybe we need to do this. To kill an error is as good a service, sometimes even better than establishing a new truth or fact. So I think we need to kill the error that fat makes you fat, and eating carbohydrates will make you lean and healthy. And we even see this. The lay press is ahead of the medical press. So, 1984, this butter's eggs and bacon are going to kill you, and then butter's back 2014. Let's talk quickly about the metabolic syndrome, because if you're out there, you could self-identify whether you have this, because this is a bad weed, and you've got to get rid of the root. So what the metabolic syndrome is you've got a cascade of 5 things. If you got 3 of them, you got it. If you got all 5, you're exponentially at risk for not just cardiovascular disease, but a multitude of other things that you don't want to get, including Alzheimer's and multiple forms of cancer. So it's high blood pressure, a low good cholesterol, a high triglyceride, weight around the middle, waist circumference, and a high fasting glucose. So I'm a traditional Western doc, so you go to your doctors and you got high blood pressure, they give you a pill. You got weird cholesterol, they give you a pill. If you got weight around the middle, they tell you to eat less and exercise more, and if your sugar's high, they either ignore it or give you another pill. So if there was a root to this weed, do you want to treat the branches or do you want to get rid of the root? And I explain to people you want to get rid of the root, and the root is called this, insulin resistance. And Steve Phinney made this slide, and I love it because everyone out there right now can determine where they are on this continuum. So I'll just take, a patient I saw the other day who was a football player in college. So when he was a football player in college, he was lean. He probably had a pretty good BMI because he was a lineman, muscular guy, but he could eat anything. And he didn't become obese because he would be out there exercising 3 hours, come back to the training table, have bread, even some sweet drinks. Muscles and liver were insulin sensitive, and he could store that carbohydrate for the next day. So he ate the meal, insulin goes up, insulin sensitive, store it, life is good, go run, go play. But then he broke his ankle and changed his lifestyle a bit, meaning wasn't exercising. Finished college, broke the ankle, ate the same diet, genetics, African American, became more insulin resistant. So this is how his body started to respond. So he became more insulin resistant, meaning the muscles and liver said, nope, I'm insulin resistant. Eat the same carbohydrates, insulin's got to go up, 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 higher, higher, higher to try to dump that blood sugar. You only have 1 teaspoon of sugar in your bloodstream at any one time, and a big gulp is about 40 teaspoons or something crazy like that. So you got to dispose of it. And if you're insulin resistant, muscles in the liver don't want it, insulin gets jacked up, and you're going to store it as fat. And that's the switch. And when that happens in each of us is a little bit different. So it starts, if any of y'all are out there and got weight in the middle, you can go back and say, at what point in your life did this happen? That's when you were becoming insulin resistant. So carbs aren't good or bad. It just depends on your level of insulin resistance and are you at a homeostasis. So I hope that slide makes sense to you. This helps you determine where you are and what's right and wrong. So this is the kind of the march to type 2 diabetes. We'll go a couple more minutes here and then open up for questions. So this red line is insulin resistance. The green line is what happens to our beta cells, which secrete insulin. And then here, blue line is blood glucose. So in medicine, they wait till your blood glucose is high before they say you got a problem. But so this is normal, all's good. You have a meal, your insulin goes up, but you dispose the sugar and insulin goes down pretty quick. As you're starting to develop insulin resistance and probably becoming obese for the majority who aren't really active, your insulin resistance goes up, making more and more insulin, but you're dumping that into fat so efficiently, your blood glucose is fine. So they say, oh, you're fine. You don't got prediabetes yet. Your sugar's fine, but you're heading that way. Let's go down a few, maybe 5, 10 more years. So now your insulin resistance is really up, and your fasting sugar might be 110. They say, well, you don't have diabetes yet. But at this point in time, your beta cells already may be failing. So you're starting to lose the game here. And then maybe 10 years later, they say, whoa, you got a blood sugar at 250. You got diabetes. But at this point, you've been 20 years in. Your pancreas is like, you've squeezed all the juice out of the lemon. And this is a tougher hole to get out of. That's why, back here, this is where you want to catch it, not over here. Because at this point, you may have already had your first heart event. A real test you can get, you were asking about different tests, but if you get a glucose tolerance test with an insulin level, you can determine what your insulin and glucose response is to a load of sugar. A well-healthy person won't have high insulin. They're like this blue curve. Insulin goes up a little bit, get rid of the sugar. So these curves, they'll get rid of the sugar, but it's a slow thing, and their insulin levels go really high. So Dr. Joseph Kraft just passed at age 96. He wrote a book in 1976 called Diabetes in You. He had 10,000 of these glucose tolerance patterns, and he called these people here diabetes in situ. Meant they had it, they just didn't know it. They were kind of pre-diabetes. All the chronic diseases really tie into this insulin resistance. I'm going to just cruise through these really quick here. So is insulin resistance, is this a rare thing? This is Jeff Volek's data here. He would suggest that 75% of the country now is insulin resistance, meaning they're either diabetic or pre-diabetic or obese. So it's actually the minority of people now that have a normal metabolism who can get away with this stuff. I'm not going to cover this slide. This is, if any of y'all want to look into kind of the godfather of all this, his name is Gerald Raven, and he published 800 papers on, he called it Syndrome X before they called it metabolic syndrome, and his work is revolutionary. But read his work. He had it figured out, in the 1990s, and this is a slide from 2005 showing the full spectrum of insulin resistance. Trying to dispose of glucose with more insulin is kind of like if you've ever been to Tokyo and gotten on the subway, they've got these people here that try to stuff more people into the cars. So this is sugar and this is insulin. So what we're trying to do with more and more insulin is trying to stuff more, people into the subway. Or it's kind of like this, if you've ever traveled and you're trying to get one more shirt into that suitcase, and your body's the insulin there, you just need more force. And that's how we're trying to deal with this now, at least in most of standard medical care. More insulin, this is a slide that's just what happens in the liver. So what happens is the liver produces these triglycerides. It's called de novo lipogenesis. So the more insulin you got, the more resistance you got, the more you pump out these triglycerides. The more medicine we give you, the more time you got, the more insulin, your diabetes is getting worse. I mean, it's non-negotiable. They'll give out diabetes medications with the sugar. I'm not making this up. More meds and insulin, if it's driving your sugar lower, doesn't mean you're getting healthier. Actually, most of our data show that the more medicine it takes to make your sugar good, actually you die sooner than if we left you alone. So just because your doctor says your sugar's good, but you're on 6 different medications to control that, may not be a good idea. Diabetes is rotting your body inside and out, so it's really sad. I see it every day. I'm not going to go into that one. Less carbs, less insulin. This is a hospital study. If we don't feed them carbohydrates, we don't need to give them insulin. This is how I practice medicine in my hospital. Insulin, if it's up, inhibits lipolysis. Now let's just pause a second about what that means, even for athletics. So if I have a bagel 20 minutes before the start of a marathon and it shoots my insulin up and it's a marathon and I want to burn fat the first 13 miles, insulin inhibits lipolysis. Is that going to work? Absolutely not. So you don't, and this is life too. So if you're fat in the middle and you want to burn body fat and your insulin is up all day, I'm sorry, you can't use your own fat for fuel. You got to get rid of the insulin. You know, it's not about burning the calories. You got to get rid of the insulin. Doing this sometimes is like thinking about a color you've never seen. And, you know, I give talks in my community. Okay, so you can lose weight, get healthy, and not be hungry all the time and not go to the gym. And they're like, oh, that's crazy. What are you selling me? Because they don't believe you. They're like, no, it's everyone's told me it's got to be painful. But this is it, you know, so you got to be over here, you know, so innovators and early adopters, you know, that's what UCAN's doing with their product. That's, you know, what we're doing in our community. We have the largest low carbohydrate support group in the country in a town of 3,000. This is my hospital recipe binder, so when we're teaching this to hospital patients, they're like, well, what do I eat? And I give them this binder that has about 200 recipes, and they're like, oh my gosh, that looks really good. I walk around with these plates. You know, if you're insulin resistant, here's the stuff that they want you to eat. I just say, no, it's off the list. You can't eat that stuff. But the good news is there's eggs and meat and nut and cheese, all this good stuff. You know, like, oh, wow, they told me not to eat that. You know, it's like, well, no, you can eat that. It's okay. You know, just check your sugar. It'll tell you everything you need to know. But yeah, here's a couple pictures of some group meetings we have. You know, we're just, a community is just yeah, I mean, what is a healing community? This is social context, because this is a process. You have to have like-minded people around you supporting you in a common goal. A lot of people don't have that community. They'll go home and people think, ah, that's crazy, you know, can't help you out, you know, I don't think that's true, or they'll tell you that's going to kill you. So you need to look outside of that to get help, because this isn't an easy thing to do necessarily. You need support. You know, so these are what happens in our meetings. You know, we talk, we have a chef here, Chef Scott. He'll talk about simple things to cook. We actually have a meal, give a talk. Our press is on this. They're writing stories almost every week about it. Here's some people, some local champions. This is my friend. She's lost 100 pounds, and she's our social media guru, Melanie Miller. This wonderful lady's lost 110 pounds. Here she is with her daughter. Lance wrote me the other day he could fit into his wedding ring again, you know, for the first time in 20 years. And that was just, I mean, to him that meant a ton. And actually wrote me last week and said the first time he flew on a plane and didn't need a seatbelt extender. You know, wow, I mean, that's a big deal. Julie Jordan, over 100 pounds off. This gentleman here, Sam White, was a hospital patient, and he actually has recorded the highest reduction of A1C, for those of you who understand. This means, this A1C of 23 means his average sugar was 800. A1C is 5 is healthy. This is just with dietary change. And they did this kind of worldwide Twitter contest of low carb A1C reduction, and here he is. He reduced his A1C by 18 points. Another friend, this is 4 months, A1C 17 to 6. So this is real. You know, this is not, I'm not making this stuff up. Hospital patient, 85 pounds down, all his meds in the trash. Ron, I think I'm going to just, because we're at 8 o'clock, I've got slide. These are people that have lost half their body weight running marathons now, you know, on the same plan. And they're like, yeah, they're healthy people. It's crazy. But they know it's not just going to go away. They can't go back to their old ways. But maybe we'll take some questions now. And,
Absolutely, Mark. Just, really,
quite a little long.
no worries. That's tremendous stuff, and you know, I just want to say your wealth of information, and I think the passion for really educating people and promoting the healthier community really shines through. So that was wonderful. I just want to do a quick reset here. If Mark, if you don't mind, maybe hanging around another 15 minutes, we'll answer some questions. We'll also just take folks a little bit through UCAN, and you know, Mark's mentioned it a couple times, what it is, how it fits into this whole philosophy. So, Mark, why don't I give your voice a rest for a couple minutes? I'll take you through what UCAN is, and then we'll take a few minutes and answer some questions. How's that sound?
Perfect.
All righty. So, awesome. I will get this over to my presentation here in just a moment. All right. Right. So, you know, I think just in terms of where UCAN fits in, you heard Mark talk about it, you know, in the context of utilizing it as part of his running fuel. But it really fits so many of the principles that Mark was describing, both in terms of blood sugar and insulin control. And, what we're about as a company is promoting healthy athletes, longevity, health, and fitness. That is really the name of the game for all of us, and what can keep us enjoying the sport. So really what's unique about UCAN is what we call SuperStarch. Excuse me. SuperStarch, it's the carbohydrate in UCAN, and it behaves very differently than your traditional energy sources, your bagels, bananas, your sports gels, energy drinks, sugar-based sports drinks. So what you see on the screen, the blue line, it's pretty typical of, kind of a high glycemic, fast-acting, quick energy carbohydrate that most people will consume either throughout the day or before exercise. And really what's going to happen there from a blood sugar standpoint is you're going to get that big rise and drop in energy. Meanwhile, the SuperStarch comes in nice and slowly, keeps your blood sugar very, very steady. So why does that matter? When we think about the way that energy is delivered, kind of what we've been doing traditionally, especially in athletics, has been emphasizing those sugars and those quick energy sources. And, that sugar spike is, of course, followed by the sugar crash, and that can come with a host of issues, fatigue, your body produces certain stress hormones, you get hungry, you're irritable, it impacts your mood. Outside of exercise, from a day-to-day standpoint, when you're consuming a lot of those bagels, croissants, bananas, sugary drinks throughout the day, you get a rise in insulin and you're not putting your body in an optimal fat burning state. So, a lot of what Mark's talking about, it's really an energy crisis as well. You're constantly fueling with these quick sugars or quick energy sources, and you need to do it over and over and over again. So what's so unique about UCAN and why this carbohydrate behaves so differently actually stems from its origin. So the SuperStarch was originally developed for our founder's son, Jonah, who suffers from a very rare metabolic disorder. So Jonah has a life-threatening condition called glycogen storage disease, which requires him to be fed previously every 2 hours consistently throughout the day to keep his blood sugar and his energy steady. So for his family, this required 3 to 4 feedings in the middle of the night. They had to feed him, set multiple alarm clocks to wake up, make sure they didn't miss a feeding, or it would be life-threatening for Jonah. So his parents, they were very proactive, and they knew that, in their lifetime, there wasn't going to be a cure for this condition. It only affects about 5,000 kids in the U.S., so very rare metabolic disorder. So they started in 2000, they started a foundation, and they started researching all different types of nutrition methods to alleviate this challenge that they were having in terms of blood sugar management. So for 8 years, some of the top carbohydrate researchers in the world, they were looking at different barleys, tapiocas, different starches, and eventually what they found was starting with a non-GMO cornstarch. They then put it through a very specific cooking process, just heat, water, and pressure, no chemicals, no enzymes. The way the starch is cooked causes it to break down slowly and steadily over time. So 2008, the starch came about. Jonah was able to take roughly 90 grams of it prior to sleeping at night, and because it broke down so slowly and steadily, very consistent energy delivery over several hours, he was able to get 8 hours of sleep without having to wake up and be fed. It was totally life-changing for his family. His mom talks about posting on Facebook when he was 8 years old, the first time they got a full night's sleep from the time he was born. Really life-changing, and it could have ended there, but the same dilemma that these kids like Jonah have is sort of, as Mark's talked about at length, what a lot of us are going through in terms of struggling to control our blood sugar and manage our blood sugar. So, this quickly became something that was adopted by athletes, by endurance athletes who are trying to manage their energy, but also by people just who are trying to consume a healthier form of carbohydrate throughout the day to control their blood sugar, to help curb cravings, to help a host of, as a tool to aid with, a host of these challenges that occur from constantly taxing your blood sugars and spiking your blood sugars. What's also so unique about UCAN, though, in the context of everything Mark was speaking about, was its impact on the hormone insulin. So if you remember, going back to what Mark was saying, insulin is produced when you get a rise in blood sugar. When you get a blood sugar spike, your body produces insulin to compensate for that. And it's different, to varying degrees depending on your metabolism. But with the SuperStarch, what's so cool about it is because it's trickling in so slowly and steadily, because it's not raising your blood sugar, there's no need for the body to produce this hormone insulin. So with UCAN, you're getting a very steady and consistent energy source that, because it isn't stimulating insulin, isn't blocking your ability to burn fat. And this has gotten a lot of people talking about UCAN like a hybrid car, you know, because it's still a carbohydrate. It's UCAN and the SuperStarch is a carbohydrate source, but it's a carbohydrate that acts very, very differently than other carbohydrates because it trickles in slowly and doesn't limit your ability to burn fat. So just like a hybrid car with UCAN, you're burning carbohydrate, but you're also burning fat. So Mark, I'm kind of fascinated. How did you first hear about UCAN? How did it come across your radar, and why were you intrigued by it?
I probably saw something online, you know, with almost what you shared there with just insulin curves, you know. So, I mean, how I saw it first, I honestly don't know. But when I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, that makes sense, you know, because that's the physiology of what we want to do, whether, you know, you have diabetes or you don't have diabetes. And I believe I contacted Peter at some point, the founder, and just mentioned I was a physician interested in what, you know, I think what you're doing is right on the money. That may have been like 3 years ago. And that's probably when I started using the product, you know, for events and training about 3 years ago.
Very cool, Mark. And so I'll just quickly run folks through what the products are and get a little bit of your take on how you've been using them. So the SuperStarch is the key ingredient in UCAN, and that's, again, out of what makes the products unique. So SuperStarch is the carbohydrate. It's the energy source in the products. You flip around a packet of UCAN, you see 30 grams of carbs, you see 0 sugar, because, again, this is giving you energy and consistent, steady energy, non-insulin spiking energy without sugar, and that's really the key. So what's really cool about UCAN is, you know, that sustained energy without sugar. It's applicable in so many different contexts. It's certainly great as a pre-exercise food choice, and even the liquid UCAN, you know, we reference it as a food because it's not a hydration drink that you're sipping on slowly. It's a little bit starchier in consistency, and you can consume it all, you know, prior to your exercise. It digests very easily, and then it'll just keep your blood sugar and energy steady for a couple hours. But similarly, you know, we have people just utilizing it throughout the day, that 3 o'clock feeling, right, that we all talk about. So much of that is tied into dips in blood sugar, and what do? You grab a sugary drink to compensate for that. So again, being able to smoothen out your blood sugars throughout the day, I mean, that's getting you on the road to what Mark's talking about. UCAN can be a tool to aid in that process. Like like anything, we tell people this is not a miracle, but it's an extremely effective metabolic tool to both control your blood sugar and prevent these rises in insulin. The UCAN with protein, it's similar concept. It's just the SuperStarch paired with protein. So, Mark, this is we saw you actually utilizing this product prior to your race, which is perfectly fine. Just speak a little bit about how you personally use the UCAN with protein.
Yeah, so if it's a long race like a marathon or ultra, I'll put, you know, I'll have a shake of the protein before the race, you know, 30 minutes, an hour before the race. Maybe even if it's a longer race, have a couple of them because I want to get some. There's something about satiety, you know, especially a longer race. Like if you want to have satiety, and that, like if you're hungry for some reason out there, it doesn't put your brain in a good place. So I think the protein, at least for me, kind of is a nice slow, gives me satiety and kind of a slow burn. So I'd like that before longer events. If I'm going to do really long training runs that are race specific, I'll have that before a training run. If I'm not going to use a SuperStarch, you know, so in the summertime, you know, I think that if you're in a warm climate, the key is the sodium and the magnesium. So to hydrate, if you just start pounding free water before and during all these long runs in the summer, you know, it's not going to go well for you. I mean, you need the sodium. So if you have the hydrate before a long run, anything really over an hour, I think, in the summer, it kind of pre-hydrates you and kind of super hydrates. It's like carrying an extra water bottle because that sodium and magnesium will help your cells absorb a little more fluid on the front end. And those little straw packages, so I tucked those in my shorts at the Boston Marathon this year. I had about 3 of those. It was pretty warm. It was about 70 to 75 degrees. So I stuffed about 3 of those little straws there's 0 calories in those, but they give you the sodium. So every time I would get a real bottle, like someone would hand you like a real water bottle with a lid, you know, like you get at a 7-Eleven, you know, kids are out there giving you those things. So about every, you know, maybe 6 to 8 miles, you'd come across like a real bottle. So I'd take the lid off, mix up the hydrate, and drink that. Most of the water that was at the aid stations, you just pour over your body to keep cool. But you know, Tim Noakes has written about this. You can very easily overhydrate with free water. So the hydrate, I think, is a powerful product. And again, like it depends on your goal. Training is specific to whatever it is you're trying to do for adaptation. So if you're just going to go on a really, really slow, long run, I mean, just go run, right? Maybe if it's hot, take some hydrate, which is 0 calorie. You're just trying to get out there and burn fat. But if it's closer to an event and you're trying to do something at a pace that you're going to try to achieve during your race, you're going to try to see how your stomach tolerates certain things. That's where you get a little more specific to what you're going to do during the race. So kind of with every answer, it depends on what your goal is for that session, and it depends on you.
Excellent, Mark. And then finally, we got the UCAN snack bars, which I tell people think of these as steady energy bars, not protein bars. So again, just like the UCAN protein drink, got a little bit of protein in them, also some fat, which will help curb hunger, which will help with satiety. But the key with these bars is the superstarch. So again, these are giving you that nice, even and steady blood sugar. And these bars have a small amount of sugar in them, 5 to 6 grams of sugar. The powders don't have any sugar. But again, with these bars, the primary carb source is the superstarch, which I just want to stress, I have some questions in here, people asking how this compares to other products. I mean, the sports nutrition industry is built on sugars and maltodextrin. So, I mean, they're truly, we look at this as a new technology. There's truly nothing out there that compares to superstarch and the steady and consistent blood sugar that UCAN provides. And it all comes back to the origins. They were in the development of this carbohydrate, they were looking to find the best blood sugar regulating, blood sugar sustaining energy source for this medical condition. So they were evaluating everything for this sole purpose. And I just want to go back real quick to this, blood sugar graph. I mean, what we look at, what we see in the blue line, that's maltodextrin, right? So, I mean, pick the brand and flip the label around. If it's not simple sugar, maltodextrin is sort of the industry standard as the quote unquote complex carbohydrate. And it's sort of a misnomer. Maltodextrin, it's complex from a chemistry standpoint. It's from a structural standpoint, but in terms of how people think of complex carbohydrates, maltodextrin is by no means at all regulating your blood sugar. It's something that you have to consume over and over and over again, and it's both stimulating that blood sugar response as well as we see in this slide, stimulating that insulin response. So many of those issues that Mark is talking about that a lot of people encounter when they're constantly getting that insulin spike, it's really occurring because of so many, in some cases for athletes, because of these sugary fuels that we're constantly pounding. We had another interesting question, and Mark, I wanted to get your perspective on this, and we'll start taking some questions now to round this out just for about another 5 or 10 minutes, Mark. So we had Ryan ask us about, being on a ketogenic diet, being in ketosis, and kind of how to think about UCAN in that context. And Mark, you touched on this, but the ketogenic diet's often, I guess, less than 50 or in some cases less than 25 grams of carb per day, virtually a 0 carb diet. And what's kind of interesting about UCAN is while it is classified as a carbohydrate, because it doesn't stimulate that insulin response, we've had really interesting anecdotal feedback from folks that are on this ketogenic diet who will actually test their ketone levels on beta hydroxybutyrate being one of the main ketones that will indicate whether or not you're in ketosis, and they find that their levels, even when consuming UCAN, have indicated that they're able to remain in ketosis. So Jeff Volek says it best. It's not exactly clear like how many carbs of superstarch you can consume and stay in ketosis. That's something that you have to test, and that's individual, but it's clear because this is a different energy source that it's not the same as other carbs. Like, it's not going to kick you out of ketosis the same as other carbohydrate sources. Do you have any feedback on that, Mark? Anything you've encountered with folks
what you need to think about there is, so say you're in a race or training, so there's insulin independent pathways of glucose utilization. So when you're exercising, you're out not at the starting line when you're sitting around, but actually 30 minutes in when you're going, you can dispose of carbohydrates without insulin. So probably just a little trickle of a gel. If you have like 3 gels, that's not going to work. But you can even trickle in, a little sports drink on the course, and it's going to dispose of that without insulin. So even someone who's on a ketogenic, so again, what's your goal of being ketogenic? Some people are trying to lose weight. Some people are using ketogenic for performance. Some people just want to just see where it takes them. They're using it for anti-inflammatory, autoimmune conditions. So while you're exercising, you're using something with a little slow-release carbohydrate while you're exercising. Your body's disposing of that carbohydrate without insulin release. That's different than when you're sitting on the couch, watching Netflix or something. So again, you can, if you have a glucometer, you can check it. If you have a ketone meter, but again, these are highly variable too, because as you exercise, your body starts to use those ketones. So sometimes the exercisers don't have that same response, from a precision meter, for example, is 1 meter, or ketonics, which is a breath. So don't trust your instincts on how you feel and what your goal is versus chasing what the meter says, because I see some people, they're so tied up in what the meter says, and they're feeling really good, they're achieving their goals, but the meter's not saying what they should, or it's confusing. Then they get all frustrated when they're actually doing, like, they're kicking ass and they're doing everything right. So I think there's a lot to learn about even how we measure the ketones correctly. But yeah, so again, everyone's an N of 1, so to say, so experiment with things. But again, while you're exercising, your body will use carbohydrate, and the fat can access even, you need a little bit of carbohydrate trickling in to be able to really burn that fat too. So you don't want to be completely void. You saw my pre-race meal there. I had a little banana and, ton of almond butter on that thing, in the morning. And those UCAN bars, if it's a longer event, you put those in like a little fanny pack. I had, I believe, 2 of those UCAN bars over 50 miles, and they gave a little satiety. So instead of gels, I didn't have any gels. That was my only solid calorie, were those bars. Everything else was liquid.
Mark, we're getting a lot of questions of this variety, just on a day-to-day basis for people that are trying to go low carb, or even people that are kind of trending that way and trying to moderate their carbohydrates. What's an example, kind of on a daily basis, of what you will eat for meals? Just so people, and with the caveat, we have to say that everybody's going to respond differently, but it just helps people get in that frame of mind of how to think about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone needs to eat a real whole food, healthy diet. So, I mean, what I have for breakfast, I have friends who are farmers. I'll have like 3 real farm fresh eggs and throw whatever's left in the fridge from last night in there. It could be some bacon, tons of veggies. So if people think this is like an all meat diet and no vegetables, they're absolutely wrong. I eat a ton of vegetables loaded with olive oil. I think vegetables are a vehicle to get olive oil in your body. I'm not afraid of fat. I'm not trimming fat off of meat. I'm not buying lean meat. But getting the best quality I can, so we have a market here called Crestview, which is good quality meat. Farmer markets, get as much good quality stuff there. But it's probably like your grandmother ate, just without the bread and the pastries. It's all real food, tons of veggies, non-starchy veggies, full fat dairy, cream, cheese, butter, eggs. Yeah, it's like stuffed fish, stuff that, how could someone say this is dangerous food? It's the kind of stuff we've eaten for years and years and years. This fresh, either out of the sea or from your garden, or from your local, butcher shop.
I think that's super helpful. I'm just laughing because I see a big yum with all caps in the chat as you were describing it.
Big omelet in the morning, because she's like, how can you put all that? It usually has a big pat of guacamole on the top too. So it's like usually 12 ingredients in this big omelet, and man, you'd never get tired of that every day. It's like, wow, you just crave this thing. Because usually I run early in the morning, so I'll come back, and you've worked up an appetite, and you make this big 3-egg omelet, and then I don't have lunch half the time, because you're good. You have a breakfast like that, you just work through the day, and you come home and you have dinner.
I'll go with one more, Mark. So Linda asks, she's a type 2 diabetic, a recreational endurance cyclist, and also confronting metabolic syndrome. How do you suggest while I fuel for 8+ hours? Are you saying fewer carbs are okay? So you obviously talked about, a little bit about your nutrition plan for your long ultra, but maybe you just might highlight that again a little bit.
So for 8 hours of a workday or 8 hours of an athletic event?
Well, it's a good question. It seems like she's saying 50, 60 slow miles for cycling.
Okay.
Yep. So
Yeah,
I'm assuming
if
it's
you're
further
happy
cycling.
to burn fat, so 50, that's a long ride. So, I think other folks would probably say similar. So if I go out and it's anything under 2 hours, I don't need a darn thing. Just go out the door and run or cycle. But if you're out there 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, yeah, that's where, 100 to 200 calories an hour, of something slow burn, whether it's a pat of nut butter or a superstarch bar, something that's going to give you some satiety and slow burn. But yeah, I think it's hard to go out and exercise 6 hours with absolutely no calories because, that's not a smart thing to do, unless you're just super, super fat adapted and you're trying to just do that just because. But yeah, give yourself yeah, you have these insulin independent pathways. So you don't need 400 calories an hour. You don't need to match what you burn by some, iPad program that says you're burning, 400 calories an hour, therefore you need to eat 400 calories, because you're burning the fat on your body, not the fat you eat. You're really just keeping those blood sugar levels stable, because when your blood sugar levels drop, your brain says, I don't like this, and the brain is what controls bonking. So the brain will shut you down. It says, I'm not in homeostasis, I'm going to shut off motor units. So again, yeah, play with it a little bit, and if this thing called a bonk, I think, is just complete heresy, because if you're somehow sensing something ain't right, take a little carbohydrate, slow down a little bit, and recover. It doesn't mean your day is over. I think the sports gel and drink industry has convinced us that as soon as you sense something is bad, it's like the toilet bowl of doom is now going to come on your back. But that's your brain, right? That's if you're like, okay, I have a bad patch here, and I know how to get out of it. You got to know how to get out of it, because you're going to have bad patches. And that's called, training, play with things in your training.
And, Mark, I was really fascinated to hear your answer to that. I'll just piggyback off some of what you said. Linda, and for those asking about using UCAN, to fuel ultras and Ironmans, we have several of those questions. That's what's so kind of unique about UCAN, along with everything Mark's been talking about, training your body on a day-to-day basis to become more efficient by controlling your insulin. Like, you'll really find UCAN from an energy source during exercise is so different than the traditional notion of needing to try to stuff down 250, 300 calories per hour. So for any long bouts of exercise, whether you're on the bike, whether you're running, what people are doing with UCAN is taking a serving of the powder roughly every 75 to 90 minutes. So you'll drink a serving before, and then a packet, which we say lasts roughly 90 minutes to 2 hours. That's only about 110 to 120 calories. So that serving, you can, because of the way the starch digests, you can concentrate it as thick or as thin as you want. So, for a long endurance ride, you might concentrate 3 or 4 servings of the UCAN powder into one bottle, and then let's say it's 4 servings, every 90 minutes you're drinking a fourth of that bottle. You might drink it over the course of 10 or 15 minutes, because again, you're trying to feed with UCAN if you can. It's effective, kind of thinking of it as a food source that's going to sustain you for a long period of time. And then beyond that, a lot of people, if you kind of want the variety, or you're out there for a really long time and you get hungry, mixing in some of the UCAN snack bars, alternating every 75 to 90 minutes, one time taking a serving of the powder, one time taking a serving of the bar. That works great. And then, like Mark talked about, you could just simply mix in the UCAN hydrate, put that in your water bottle, just sip on that separately. If you're exercising in a hot climate, you're a heavy sweater, you need the additional electrolytes, especially if you're out there for a long period of time. But UCAN, once you nail it for these long workouts, it really simplifies things, because you're not, taping the buffet of sugar or the buffet of gels to your bike. And it's really freeing to be able to exercise for a long period of time, and not every 15 minutes you're, the watch beep and have to drink something. So it's a different approach. And I would just say, when you're using UCAN for these long workouts, don't necessarily use it, or I shouldn't say necessarily, don't at all use it the way you'd use other sports nutrition. Kind of stick with what we recommend, see how that works for you, and then play around with your training and adjust from there. Well, with that, Mark, we've taken a lot of your time tonight. So I just want to really, really thank you. I know we have a ton of questions here. So, guys, I will be sending everyone out a replay of this webinar, and you can feel free to respond directly to that email with any questions that you may have for me. Mark, what's the best way for folks to follow your work, and if they wanted to connect with you, is there any good way you recommend they do that?
Yeah, I have a website. It's called thenaturalrunningcenter.com, and we put posts and blogs up on there. I have a running shoe store in West Virginia that sells minimal shoes called Two Rivers Treads. So if you're in the market for minimal shoes, we're a small local running store, kind of old school, trying to fight the big market stores on the Amazon places. So you can still order from us online. It's tworiverstreads.com. And my email is afrundoc@gmail.com. And if you have a specific question, I'll do my best to answer that. And, glad to help people out, and share your questions, with Varun after this podcast, and we'll maybe put together something after this and try to, answer some of the common ones. But it's been fun. We've been on this an hour and a half. I'll let you all go back to your day, whether it's morning or evening where you are. Have a great day and keep going outside and doing healthy things for yourself.
Well, Mark, I really want to thank you again. This is just amazing, such a wealth of information, and really for you to come on here and share this with everybody, give up an hour and a half of your time. It was fun. It was informative. I think really just big thanks to you and for all the work you're doing in the community. And yeah, I just want to just reiterate, Mark's just the running store, the whole community's built. It's really supportive, great community. We love being involved with them, and it's, just kudos to you, Mark. Appreciate you being on and appreciate what you're doing. And
we have
really
race
appreciate it.
freedomsrun.org. So September 30th, if you want to come out and run through some battlefields in West Virginia, we're only about an hour from Baltimore and D.C.
Say the name of that race again. I talked over you.
Freedoms
One more time.
Run. Freedomsrun.org.
Freedomsrun.org. Awesome. Well, excellent. Well, for Mark Cucuzella, I'm Varun Sriram. Really want to thank everybody for joining us. So many great questions. Stay tuned. All this information will be sent to you. You'll have plenty of time to digest it, and then please do feel free to reach out directly to me if you do have any questions. Thank you so much, everybody.
Very much.
Talk to you soon.
Have a great night. Bye.